So the feedback that we heard for JavaScript, right, was we dumped you right in projects, and we were like, okay, let's just blitz you in, let's build something right out of the gate, right? And people went, whoa, whoa, whoa. I don't know what words you're using. I don't know what functions are. I don't know what these curly braces are doing. I don't know what a variable is. Why are you saying the word const, all of that stuff, right? And so we took a step back, and this is now the second cohort where we've said, okay, let's try and introduce you to computer science first, right? Computer science is actually the science of how the computer operates, right? It is trial and error, like most science is, but it behaves a little bit more logically, right? And so we try and expose you to these terms and say, all right, listen, even if you don't know how to do this yet, let's just ease you into those terms, just get you exposure to that. And you go, whoa, I'm still overwhelmed by all of those terms. That's okay, right? Because now that you've got all of those concepts exposed to you, today is actually the first day that we dive into the projects, right? And so we're going to build something, not that yesterday's scripts weren't useful, but today's the first day where we start going, well, why do I even need to know all of this stuff, right? Today's the first day we kind of transition away from computer science and into the practical nature of project-based learning. So if you are overwhelmed now, that is okay, right? Imagine if someone went to a boot camp and went, no, it was kind of easy. Well, I would say that that was a really bad boot camp that you attended, right? This overwhelming feeling is totally natural, and why we say that imposter syndrome on what, day 2 we teach you about imposter syndrome? It will kick in, right? And this is hands down the toughest part of the program, but it is a roller coaster ride, right? So you'll get to the end of class tonight and be like, okay, I felt like I understood 1% of JavaScript in the past 3 nights, and I understand another 1% of it tonight. Well, that's a huge leap forward. If it took you 3 nights to get to 1% and 1% in one night, imagine how much more quickly we will go in all of the other weeks of JavaScript, right? So the good news is you have a week off from me next week. Nathan's DevOps material is, I don't want to say easier, but it's a different pace, right? It's not quite as vocab intensive. However, we have weeks and weeks of JavaScript to go. And we've already exposed you to all of the basic concepts of computer science. So now we get to switch back to that project-based learning and really dive into, okay, let's practice that. And what are you going to hear from me? You're going to hear all of that terminology that is probably sitting on the surface and just barely soaking in, right? So you're going to hear me saying functions. You're going to hear me saying curly braces and square brackets. You're going to hear me saying variables and for loops. You're going to hear me saying all of this stuff that we just kind of dumped on you. Well, we dumped that on you so that as it's soaking in, we get more and more practice with it. So tonight, we're going to actually build a to-do list app. So we're going to see for the first time, we're going to touch our HTML again. We're going to get set up in building our first little user interface that is interactive. And then we're going to learn how JavaScript exists outside of Node, which is how we've been using it so far, right? We've been saying, hey, Node, please go run this JavaScript for us. Well, tonight, for the first time, we're going to see JavaScript running in the browser. So we're going to get our HTML or CSS set up the way that we always do, but we're going to learn about the script tag and how we can get the browser to not only execute our JavaScript, but to have it kind of standing by so that when the user requests something to be done, we can do that in our own code. So I know it feels like a blitz. I know it feels like a lot. I know it feels like you're just getting all of these things dumped on you, but that is intentional, right? And it's intentional not just because, hey, it's a boot camp, this has got to be hard on you. It's, hey, I got to expose you to all of these words so that they're defined somewhere so that we can say we talked about them at some point so that when we're using them in the projects, you can start building confidence using them. So the 1 through 6 part of the homework assignment is meant to be a little bit easier, right? So if you're struggling on 1 through 6 of the homework assignment, that's when I got to go, all right, either something's not working, either I'm not taking enough notes in class, or I don't mesh with Max's teaching style, or I have to find additional resources. But as you get into that second part, the second half of the homework assignment, 7 through 10, that's when you start to get a little bit more challenging, right? And that's where it's like, okay, you know what? I am a beginner in this, and it's okay for me not to get that perfectly right. So when I score that homework assignment, I'm not scoring that homework assignment on just the last 3 questions, right? I'm going, hey, is this blitz of knowledge just kind of starting to sink in? But we still have weeks and weeks to go of JavaScript to get practice with all of those concepts, right? So I don't know if that calms anyone down or makes you even more anxious and panicked, but want to give you a little rationale into the thinking, because it's not my first time teaching these modules, right? We've adjusted our curriculum as we've gone, and we have seen that people are a little less, you know, it's really hard to get into the deep end of JavaScript unless you kind of just jump right in. And so because we've learned that, we just start shoving everyone into the deep end and then saying, all right, now that you're in the deep end, let's figure out all of the power of JavaScript, all of the concepts, all of that stuff. Because you're in the deep end, now we can reach everything that we need to, instead of starting you off and then you starting to have to reach for resources that we haven't necessarily covered. All of that said, I'm going to open it up to any questions, not just about the homework, about where we're feeling so far. In 2 weeks, we'll do a JavaScript self-assessment. So we'll go over all of these basic concepts, basically rehashing everything that we did from day 1 and 2 of this week, even more condensed though, and we'll give you little examples and then say, hey, from a score of 1 to 5, how are you feeling about this? And that's not going to impact your grade at all. That's not going to impact your standing in the class. It's not going to impact your stipend eligibility. All of that is to say, hey, what concepts really are sinking in? Which ones are you like, shut up, Max, I understand how to declare a variable? And which ones are like, I still don't get this, and you've explained it 9 times and it ain't working, right? So that self-assessment, not next week because that's DevOps, but the end of week 7, we'll do that self-assessment in class together, give you a brief overview of what that concept is, and then let yourself score yourself on that 1 to 5 concept, so that we can figure out, all right, which things need to be adjusted, right? Because a bootcamp instructor is not just running through the same thing every single time, right? This is not a typical college course where we go, oh, this is the pace that we go, so this is what we'll do. No. I make adjustments to the projects that we're covering, to how you score that self-assessment. All of that gets adjusted as we go. Okay, sorry, I opened the floor for questions and then didn't actually take any questions. Are there any questions so far? Okie doke. Reminder that one-on-ones, you can always schedule one-on-ones with me. If there is a time that you really would like to meet, but you see is not available on my Calendly, shoot me a Slack message with a couple available times. We'll find a way to work you in. Let me give me 1 second here to get set up, and then we will dive in. Okay. So we are going to work on a to-do list app tonight. And all we're going to try and do is not only get a to-do list so we can type something in and have it save it, but we're also going to make sure that we're at that level of understanding, right? So all about the boot camp is pushing you to your limits and then backing off a little bit. And once you've caught your breath, we push you to your limits again, right? And so that's what we're going to do tonight. Tonight is all about building it out and then backing off and making sure that there's understanding before we move on. Terry.
Yeah, so I had a question about the homework. with like number 6, are we creating like two different types of object, or are we just creating one object with like two different data types?
One object, two different data types.
Okay. I just had to make sure.
Good question. All right, let's fire it up. Reminder that this is the equivalent of our Friday. And not only is this the equivalent of our Friday, but you get a week off from me. And you get a nicer, easier instructor coming in who's teaching you some fun topics. So lots to look forward to here. All right, I'm going to head to my code folder. I'm going to head to my week 5 folder. I'm going to create my day 4 folder. I'm going to go ahead and open that. I am going to start my live share, and we'll put that in the chat if I can find it. We are going to go live in this project. We'll share my server in case you want to connect to mine. We are going to head back to our files, and we are going to create two files tonight. We're going to create our index.html. Had a week off from HTML, and now all of a sudden it's back in full force. We're going to do our exclamation point enter to drop in our HTML document. And then we are also going to create a new file called script.js. Doesn't matter what you name it, as long as it doesn't have spaces in it. Once you are set up, we are going to go ahead and change our title to do. Believe it or not, we are not even going to link our bootstrap in here. We are going very bare bones, right? And so the way that I do application design and engineering as a whole is I think about this as, all right, there are basically two ways of engineering. We can look at this huge, daunting task, figure out every little piece that is part of it, break every little piece down to its smallest parts, then take those smallest parts, prioritize them, and start working on them. Which sounds like a good idea. And if you're working on a complex project and you've got a lot of time to plan out, that is the right way to do it, hands down. But there's another way of doing it. And we're looking at this from, hey, we're building a little tiny to-do list, right? So instead of planning out every little feature, why don't we think about this as, hey, what's the user have to do in a to-do list app? Well, at the most basic level, the user has to be able to type in the text of their to-do item. They need to be able to add that item to the list, usually with a button, and then they need to be able to see their list. Okay, so engineering-wise, that doesn't sound too bad. Why don't we take that approach? Because just like your capstone, you're going to have all of this content, and you're like, where do I even begin? Well, what's the first thing that your user sees, right? Break that down. What's on that first page? Is it a home page? Is it a dashboard? Is it a login screen? Okay, now break that down. What's the most common thing that the user is going to interact with? Break it down that way instead of saying, I have to go plan out this entire project. Instead, break it down into, well, what's the user got to be able to do here? So I'm going to throw an H1 in here that says to-do list app. This is our first thing that's interactive, so it definitely qualifies for an app. And then I'm going to say, okay, well, in order for that app to work, they probably need to input some text. And then when they input that text, they also probably need a button to add the item. So I save that, I come over here, I look at my live server, and we've got literally to-do list app with a text box and an add button. Could we clean this up? Could we add Bootstrap? Could we use the grid system? Could we add form control as a class? Could we add BTN and BTN primary? Absolutely. But we are focused on, hey, what's the functionality here? That's the engineering approach we're taking tonight. So we're saying, all right, they know what it is. Maybe we want to add a placeholder here that says task description. Now we got a little gray placeholder, we got our add button, and we're like, all right, we're off to a good start. Now I'm like, all right, I can type in my first item and I hit the add button and nothing happens. Well, before we dive into making something happen, we need to talk about what that thing should be. What do we expect to happen? We expect that when you click this add button, the text box will probably clear out, and whatever item is here will show up further down on the page as an item in the list. Well, we don't know how to do that right now. We've got exposure to arrays. That may have something to do with it. We have this notion of HTML and attributes. Well, we got to get our JavaScript in here somehow. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to come down to the end of the body tag, right before the closing body tag, and we're going to put in a script, src, which stands for source, and we're going to say script.js, and then put in our closing script tag. Now, in order to see if our script is working, what we're going to do is go into our script.js, and now we're language switching, right? We're quite literally code switching right now. We're going from our HTML to our JavaScript down here. So down here, we're going to say console.log connected. And break this down, console.log, hey, that's a function that's built into the computer. The parentheses are saying, hey, I'm sending some data, some parameters and arguments into this function. The quotes are saying, okay, this is a string, this isn't a command I want you to execute. The word connected, close out the string, close out the parentheses. The parentheses are telling the function, I want you to go run. And the semicolon at the end is saying we're done with that line. So we come over here and I don't see no console log connected. Well, the console, we actually haven't been in yet. So in my browser, I'm going to right click and go to inspect. And then I'm going to open up the console here. It may look different in every browser. By the way, if your sidebar is on the side and you like it at the bottom more, you can click on the three dots here, at least if you're in Chrome, and change where that is docked. So I prefer my DevTools to be docked at the bottom, but totally personal preference there. So wherever you want it is fine. Okay, now I see the word connected in my console. What is this telling me? Well, why did we always do an each one color red in our CSS? Because it's very easy to get way into our coding and then going, wait, why is my CSS not working at all? And you realize that there's nothing wrong with your CSS itself. The problem is with the link between the two files. So if you are in your browser and do not see connected in the console, now's the time to ask for help.
I am not connected.
Boo.
Hey.
Go ahead and share your screen.
All right.
You are connected.
What? It says uncaught error. Oh,
so that is thanks to some Chrome extension that you have installed.
Oh, I got hell extensions.
So be careful in here because all of these Chrome extensions can also access your console. And so all of these third-party cookies as well are also related to extensions that you may have. The live reload enabled is part of live server. So that is not out of the ordinary, but it's this connected that we're looking for. And the console is really broken into two parts, not only the output that we see here, but it will also show us this is the file name that it's coming from. And then this :1 that you see right there, that is showing you what line number that is coming from in our JavaScript. So because we only have one line, of course, it's on line 1. So it's safe to ignore anything, any errors that you see here if it says Chrome extension at the part of the as the first part of the file name.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, there may be a way to filter that,
What you think?
but I don't know it off the top of my head. If you go click on the word top.
Those are my extensions. Whoa.
I think you can filter by turning those extensions off. Well, you can filter to see only what those extensions are outputting, but I don't know that you can turn it off. So that's something that I would have to look into to figure out how to make it only this page, basically. But you are connected, you're in good shape.
Thank you.
Anyone else not connected?
I am not connected.
Okay, share the screen. Okay. Let me see your index.html. Well, why are you not connected?
I don't know.
Let's try and just refresh. There you go.
Why does
You
it
just
do
need to
that?
refresh. Sometimes live server isn't as live as we would hope for it to be. So whenever you're having trouble, it's worth doing a refresh to see if that clears out the pipes.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Anyone else need help? Okay. So now we've got our JavaScript connected. We're making progress. We're like, all right, we need something to happen after they click this add button. How are we going to make that work? So what we need to do is connect our button here with our JavaScript. And this is the first time that we see what we call a JavaScript event. What is an event? It just means that the user interacted with the page some way, shape, or form. And so what we know is that an event starts with the word on. And there are all different kinds of JavaScript events. There's an on scroll, there's an on click, there's an on key button down, there's an on key button up. There's all different kinds of events. And if you just search JS events, you will see a very long list that W3 Schools gives you. The most common ones on change, if an input has something typed into it, on click, which is the first one that we're using, on mouse over or mouse out. Okay, they move the mouse into this area, all different kinds of stuff that we can do here. But we're going to focus with an on click. And what we are going to do in that on click is we're going to say add item, and that add item is going to generate an event. Now we got into some interesting territory, because this to me doesn't look like HTML anymore. That looks like JavaScript. Well, in fact, there's a handoff between the HTML and the JavaScript. We now need to tell our JavaScript, heads up, the HTML is going to send us this event called add item. In order to set that up, we now need to create a function called add item. So we are going to come down here and say const add item, because this is a function that isn't going to change every time we run it. It's going to do the exact same thing. Then to make it a function, we're going to say equals and put in our parentheses and say, hey, you're going to expect the event coming in, the event of the details of what just happened. Why are we running this add item? We're going to do our equals arrow, because this is an arrow function. And then we're going to put curly braces in. And anything that happens between these curly braces is what is going to happen every single time the add item button is clicked. Okay. Now we got to test it, because every time that we do something, we want to set up a test case to make sure we don't go way into the deep end before we realize something is broken. So we're going to just console log out, button clicked. Okay, now we come over here, we click the add button, and in our console, we should see button clicked. Again, we do have to click the add button, but what this is telling us is when we click the add button, we have successfully bridged the gap between our HTML right here and our JavaScript down here. So by adding this thing called onClick and telling it what to run, we have now accessed add item, and now it is running this function in our JavaScript that is linked to our HTML. So if you click the add item button, you'll notice if I click it 4 times, it will say 4 button clicked. That means button clicked has been logged out 4 times in a row.
Wait, so I have a question, Mac. So
Yeah.
So let's say if the user, like if you want the user input like a certain code, like let's say you want the user to input like arrow key up, arrow key down. Is that possible to do?
It sure is. That is not with the on click listeners, that would be with the on key down listener.
Oh.
So we'll get more practice with events and see how we can hook into stuff like that. That is totally possible with JavaScript.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So do we only use on click for buttons?
Not necessarily. So we could use an on click if they if for some reason we wanted them to be able to like click on the word at and have that clear out. We could do an on click on that. We can add an on click pretty much to almost any HTML element, right? So we could do an on click of, hey, when they click into this text field, I want to do something like JK, I don't care about what you have to do. We could do an on click on that, and that would also work. So we can add an on click almost anywhere. Okay, does anyone not have a button clicked in their console? Okay, so now we got to think back. What's our end goal, right? Because it's easy to get lost in the weeds here. What is our end goal? Our end goal is that when they click the add button, we need to take whatever they've typed in here and make it show up in the page. Okay, well, in order to make it show up in the page, I kind of need to know what they've typed in. So we need to bridge the gap between our HTML here and our JavaScript here to be able to access what they've typed in. So what we're going to do is we are going to say, hey, I'm going to get the input box, and I'm going to make that be stored in a new variable. Where is that input box coming from? It's coming from the HTML document. So just like console.log is a function that is built in, document is one of those keywords in JavaScript that goes, because JavaScript is used so often in HTML, the document object is going to give us access to the HTML document itself. And what do we want to do? We want to get element by ID. Now, how would you know get element by ID? You wouldn't. But just like you know about W3 schools, if we do a search for get element by ID, you will see an example of how to use it, and you'll also see a description. Get element by ID method or function returns an element with a specified value. Get element by ID is one of the most common methods in the HTML DOM, the document object model. It's used almost every time you want to read or edit an HTML element. Well, that's exactly what we want to do. We want to read an HTML element so that we can extract the value out of it. In order for it to know what element we want to get, we're going to give it a parameter. And that parameter is going to be inputted text. Now that inputted text needs to be an ID on the input itself. So we're going to add an ID here that says inputted text. Now, every line that we write, we test before we move on to the next one. We don't need our console log button clicked anymore, so we can go ahead and comment that out. Or if you're feeling particularly bold, go ahead and delete it. Then we're going to go down here and we're going to console log out our input box. Now I go back to my HTML. I go to my to-do list app. I click the add button and I see the input placeholder task description ID inputted text. You should see an input down in your console. If you don't see that input after clicking the add button, now is the time to ask for help. Anyone need a minute?
I do.
Okay.
I
Nope.
need.
Yep.
I need it.
No problem. If it's not working, check to see that you've added the ID onto your input, because this get element by ID is using whatever we type in here to go back into our HTML document and find the right ID. Once we find that ID, we store it in our JavaScript variable called input box, and then we log it out to see if it has found it. If you get null or undefined in your console, that means that this get element by ID, it couldn't find an element with that ID. So make sure that you've added your ID to the input and make sure that ID is on the input, not on the button. We already have access to the button, right? We already linked up the button to the add item function.
Yeah. That was I was missing. I was missing the I forgot to put the ID input text in the HTML file.
Gotcha. Yep. That will do it.
Sorry if we have like other data dash lang. Oh, that's my. I think that's the rest of my because it's recognizing that there's a input box there. Cool.
Okay. Now I'm like, hey, it's cool that I got the whole input, but I don't really care about the whole input. What do I care about? I care about the value of what was inputted here. So in my console log, I'm going to change my console log input box to input box.value. Then I'm going to type something in my task description, click the add button, and I should see whatever I typed into that input box come out. Okay, if I see that, now this value is actually what I want to work with. So I'm going to take out my console log and say, hey, instead, I'm going to store the value as a new variable called inputbox.value so that I can reference it down the road. Now that I've got that value, I need to make that value show up. So I need to reach back into my HTML here and have a spot that I can shove that task into a list. So I'm going to come down beneath my button and add a new unordered list, or an ordered list if you would like this to be 1, 2, 3. Either is fine. I'm not going to put anything in it because every list always starts out blank. and I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to add an ID onto this list of list items. Now that I've created that UL, I've created a hole for my JavaScript to shove the list items into. So in order to access that, I'm going to say const list UL is equal to document.get element by ID list items. Then I'm going to console log out my list UL. We haven't put anything in it. All we've done is made a hole in our HTML, gone into our JavaScript, reached back into the HTML and said, hey, give me the list items UL. So if I save that, come over here and click the add button, I should get my UL ID list items to log out. Anyone not have their list items or need another minute?
I need another minute.
You got it.
Okay, mine says error, but I literally can't find.
Go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, so watch your casing. Everything is right here, but you have a capital UL here and a lowercase UL right there.
Wait, right where? Right here?
Here. Yep, and here. So you got a capital there and a lowercase there. So as long as they match, now if you hit the add button, you should get that UL out. Good to go. Of
Thanks.
course. Anyone else need help?
I'm getting an error as well.
Okay, go ahead and share your screen. Not read properties of null reading value. Okay, so this is a really good example of this being a really intimidating error message, but it's actually trying to help us out. So the first thing we do is we look at this line number. And so it says script JS:6. That means the problem is on line 6. Then it says it's trying to read value. And I'm like, all right, well, we've only used value in one spot. So that must mean the problem is here, line 6, input value. Okay, what is it trying to read value from? Oftentimes when we get error messages, it's the line above it that's causing the problem. So over here, we're trying to access inputted text from the HTML document that is an element that has that ID. So we go to index and we look at your input, and it has an ID of inputted text with 1 T. I think inputted has 2 T's, or I spelled it wrong and you were right in your code. Either way, if we refresh and now click add, not only does that error message go away, but we also get the UL that we are expecting.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. Anyone else need help?
Yeah, you could take a look at mine really quickly.
Sure, go for it. Okay, so you're missing the part in your JavaScript for your inputted text has an inputted T text. Yep, right there. You got an
Right
extra
here in my
T in there.
JavaScript.
Yep.
Yeah, I do. I didn't even see that typo.
And then your UL should not be inside your button. Your UL should be
Yeah,
after the button. So this UL right here should be moved outside of the button to right here. I don't know if you're still with us, so I'm going to stop your screen share. Your internet may have dropped. Terry, what's up?
So I have a question about like the script. So why would you put like the script inside of body but not inside of head? Or doesn't matter where the script is placed?
It's a good question. It does matter, but not really to the point that we need to care about it right now. The problem with putting it in the head is that it will basically prevent any of your HTML from loading until your JavaScript has loaded. And normally we don't want that, right? Normally we want to display all the content and then have the script load after all of the content shows up. And so by placing it inside the body, we're still making it a valid HTML document because HTML, the element, only wants to see two things. It only wants to see a head and it only wants to see a body. So we put it at the end here to say basically load everything else, load all of the content, and then load the script.js that makes this content interactive.
So you want like put script outside of like body, like let's say like at the end of HTML.
I don't believe it's valid HTML to put it here or to put it here. It is generally preferred to put it at the end of the body so that the content will load and then the interactivity will load without blocking all of the content.
Okay. Sorry for the dumb question, but
No,
I had
not a
to
dumb question. Go ahead, Safi.
Yeah, awesome. I don't have a question per se, just two comments. The first one being, I've seen the script tag in the head as long as it's containing a deferred. Is that okay? Have you seen?
Yeah.
Have you worked?
Yes, and that's a newer feature that not all browsers support. But putting it in the putting a defer on it makes it load pretty much asynchronously. So that is totally valid to do, just a newer concept. So we don't teach it out of the gate.
Awesome. And the second comment being, now that we're getting more hands-on with JavaScript, I'm just now thinking into the future and thinking how much more important it is to be like intentional with our ID namings, because we will be essentially like not only working with it on the JavaScript but also with the CSS. So I'm just curious if there's like any like common naming conventions or any like tips and tricks that could be used when deciding what to name things, just so that things are easier.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so it's not, there's no hard and fast rule for naming them. What is really helpful is to not use spaces in your names, to not name things starting with a number. JavaScript gets a little weird with naming variables that start with a number, and HTML isn't quite as weird about that. You'll notice that I'm using something called camel casing, right? Which is, hey, if I'm not allowed to use a space in my name, how do I know that the rest of the words are there? So there are three different types of common casings used. One is called camel case, right? And that's what we basically use. It's saying, hey, the entire first word should be lowercase, and then any words after that should have the first letter uppercase. So we could say input text and stuff. This is called camel case. There are other cases as well. So one is called snake case, which is input text goes here. That's just basically using underscores between the words. And then there is also a hyphen case, but it has a clever name to it that I'm blanking, of input text goes here. right? All three of those work, but in JavaScript has said, hey, we prefer camel case. All of these will work, but we prefer the hump of the camel, the first one, to be lower, like the head, and then every hump after that to be the back, and hump that letter basically up to uppercase. So those are some things, some different case conventions that you can use. Kebab case, thank you, Terry. That's what I was blanking on. This is snake case because it snakes out, you know, everything we just extend onto it. And then this is kebab case because it looks like a little shish kebab. Every word has a dash between it. Just developers getting clever with the names. I'm going to move this to our JavaScript so it doesn't weirdly show up in our HTML. You don't have to type those out, just adding them there for code reference. As for naming IDs, the important thing is that you're being consistent and that you're watching for additional letters, right? So you're going to get the dreaded at some point in your coding career, probably in this boot camp, cannot read undefined, cannot read property undefined reading dot value. Okay, the problem isn't with the dot value. The problem is what we're trying to call the dot value on. So as long as you aren't just throwing an ID on this, like a really bad ID here would just be input. Well, at some point in our to-do list app, we're going to create another input somewhere on the page. And if we use the idea of input in one place, well, what do we call the other input? Input 2? Okay, now we're really going down a slippery slope of, oh, input 38, which one was that, right? So because we're only doing one input so far, inputted text is fine here, but maybe an even better name of that would be like add item input, so that we know exactly what that input is going to be. So we don't need to go overboard here. I have created some very long variable names, but we just want to be clear enough so that we know what we're trying to access there. So there is no convention on naming variables, but you'll pick up on some conventions that I use throughout the code, throughout all the different projects we do, and that will start to be a little bit more clear as to what we call that. Most important thing right now, though, is that you're lining up, hey, this inputted text is linking to this inputted text here, and hey, this list items is linking to this list items here. Safi, another question?
Yes, just one more question this time.
Yeah.
Would you mind detailing how the computer is interpreting that arrow case in the JavaScript file?
The snake case, you mean?
The arrow function.
The arrow function. Oh, okay. So this is, if you're used to older JavaScript, you may see a function written out like this, right? And then all of this code would go inside of it. This is the older way of declaring a function. There are some benefits to. Is there a question? So this is an older way to declare a function. It has some downsides to binding the word this to it, and some other stuff with the word this and context. Doesn't really matter. You could use this and this would be perfectly fine. And if you're reading anyone else's JavaScript code, especially if it wasn't written in the last couple of years, chances are it was written this way. However, there are some benefits to arrow functions that won't matter over the course of this bootcamp, but it is the newer, more preferred way of doing it. So basically what we're doing is, instead of saying, hey, we're declaring a function called add item and then getting access to the parameter of the event, instead we're saying, hey, make a new variable called add item, and it just so happens that what we're storing in add item is a function that is going to take the parameter of event and then execute this code whenever add item is called. When does add item get called? It's not actually getting called in our JavaScript. The browser is actually calling the add item function for us in the onClick. So basically, when this onClick fires, the browser is going to go in, look in our script.js, find our add item, and then go run all of this code because add item lines up with add item up here.
So would you prefer us to do it the old way or the newer way?
No, new way. Not that it's the end of the world. You will find literally millions of JavaScript functions are written this way, but there are some benefits later in your coding career of using arrow functions, and so that's why we teach them. Can you attach parameters to any variables? So the parameters and the parameters and the arguments need to line up. So we could actually call this anything as long as the first thing getting passed in was the event details, which the browser does for us. Then yes, we could call this anything up here. I don't know if I do believe we use that event. No, we don't use that event for anything. So we don't actually need this event here. But whenever we're using a DOM-based event, we normally put that in as the first parameter so we can access the event details if we needed to. I've also heard explosive casing called suicide casing because it will drive developers to suicide. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Okay. We've got our list UL, we've got our value. Now it's time to put it all together. So what we want to do is we want to say, hey, go to our list UL, and we want to set the inner HTML, basically the content that is inside the UL. What are we talking about? The HTML that goes here, that's what we want to set. And we want to set that inner HTML equal to this li that is in a string. Why are we putting it in quotes? Because we're not telling the JavaScript, you got to go run that li. I'm saying, no, I literally want the letters li in a tag to show up. I'm going to concatenate or add in the value of the text field. And then I am going to add in one final string with the closing li. I'm going to go ahead and save that. Come over to my browser page. I type in ABC, I hit the add button, and I get ABC showing up with a bullet in front of it. Okay, this is actually pretty cool because if I refresh this page, it will clear everything out. And if I go into my elements, I can actually see my body, right? And my body's got my script tag, it's got the UL, it's got the button, it's got all of that stuff. But if I add something in here, like first task and hit the add button, I can see my UL actually change down here. I can expand that out and see in my list item, my first task that got added. So our JavaScript is not only interacting with the HTML and getting pushed the event, the JavaScript is interacting back into the HTML document, generating out a new list item and adding it to the list. Does anyone not have a UL showing up with their first task or whatever they typed in to the text box?
I don't, but I'm gonna try to debug it real quick.
Sure.
Wait for inside the script, the script file under the list UL. Why did you make the IL a string?
Because if I said li here, it's like, what is an li? I don't know anything in JavaScript less than L. What is less than L? Right? So what the JavaScript is trying to do here is it's trying to say, all right, is li a variable that you've already defined somewhere? Do you want me to console log that out? Do you want, what's going on there, right? And we're like, no, no, no. We literally want you to put the letters LI in between the value, right? We're saying don't actually execute an LI. Don't try and understand what this is. I'm just telling you what this LI should show up as. And what happens is when we put that back in the inner HTML, it goes into the document, back to the element that we got, back to the list items, and says, oh, you want that in the inner HTML. So I'm going to take literally the letters LI, and then not literally the value, because I didn't put that in quotes, right? If we put that in quotes, what are we going to get? We're going to, anything that we type in, it's literally going to show the letters value. So I'm like, no, no, I don't want the value. I want the contents of the variable value. Where's that coming from? That's coming from our input box value. So we're taking that value, smushing it between two LIs, and shoving that inside the inner HTML of the list UL. And we know that's working not only because we can see it right here, but when we go into our inspect, we can actually see the LI that got added with our text.
Oh, I think I get it. I think I get it. So it's looking for the value, and then with that value, it's looking for the input box, and then with that, and then you go to input box, it's looking at the HTML inputted text, and it goes back to HTML, and it looks for the input text that you inputted, and it'll display it on the page.
You got it.
Okay.
Get element by ID and inner HTML are not events. Get element by ID is a function that, or a method that is built into JavaScript. And then inner HTML is a property coming from the document object model. So inner HTML is something that is built in the document object model, is basically how the HTML document, right? Everything that we see up here gets translated into a JavaScript object. That JavaScript object is actually what we're seeing right here. If I, so we are interacting with this. Where else have we seen dot notation? We've seen dots on objects, right? Think back to the homework assignment yesterday, right? We were saying school dot middle school dot teachers. What were we working with there? We were working with the data type of an object. So where does all of this list UL come from? It's coming from the HTML document, but then it's extracting out pieces of that HTML document that we can then update in our HTML. So we know get element by ID is a function because it's got parentheses after it. Whenever we call a function like add item, the function that we created right here, it's got parentheses to say, go actually execute that. But down here, we're not executing a function. We don't have parentheses anywhere. Instead, we are setting a property of inner HTML onto the object of list UL that came from the function get element by ID. And that function used an argument of list items to know what actual piece of the document that we wanted. I know that is very terminology heavy, but that's intentional, right? Because right now you're like, didn't follow any of that. Oh, maybe I followed 2% of that. That's okay, because you're going to hear me say these words over and over again. At a certain point, it's going to break that osmosis barrier, and it's going to get into the cell that is your brain. So that's okay. If you're like, I'm not a vocab person, I'm not following all of that, that's all right. You're going to hear this over and over again, and eventually you're going to get there. Not asking you to complete a technical interview, not asking you to define the difference between a function and a property or an object and an array at this point, right? We're just getting exposure to all of this. All of this comes with time. And we will do a review of all of this before the end of class. We'll go through, we'll document all of it. We'll do our numbering steps, make sure we've got that level of understanding. Does anyone have questions? Does anyone not have their first bullet showing up? Okay, take a quick break. Go head over to attendance. No, I'm not letting you go. It's not 7 o'clock yet. But go head over to attendance. And the keyword tonight is DOM, Document Object Model. And if we have time tonight, I'll pull up the terms list and we can go through vocab and definitions as well. DOM, Document Object Model. Yes, I'm aware that term has other context, but in JavaScript, they will say, oh, I'm working with the DOM right now, and they mean the Document Object Model, the bridge between JavaScript and our HTML document. Okay. Now we run into another problem. We're like thinking, oh, we're so cool. I'm going to add my first item to the list. I'm going to add the second item to the list. I hit add, and my first item disappears. And I'm like, well, that's not much of a list if I can only add one item to it. So we were feeling pretty good about ourselves up until this point, but now we got to modify our JavaScript to fix that. Does anyone have ideas on how we could fix that?
What was the question one more time?
So the problem that we have right now is if we add any other item to the list and hit the add button, it overwrites our entire list and just puts in the new item. Does anyone have ideas of how we can make it not overwrite the whole list?
Add it into an array.
Yeah, I was gonna say an array, so you store in the values and stuff, so that way it can be brought back into the list.
We could, but now we get into an interesting problem with that. What happens when we update our array, but we don't update our HTML? At this point, we don't actually need to keep track of all the values in the list because the HTML is doing that for us. So we could get really in a dangerous territory where we updated the HTML but not the array, or we updated the array and not the HTML, and now we're keeping track of data that isn't necessarily in sync with what the user is seeing. So we could add an array, and in later projects, we will do that and show how we can keep the data in sync. And in fact, React is the solution to that. React lets us work all with JavaScript data and then have the HTML automatically update based off of that. But we're a couple weeks ahead of that. So does any other ideas without using an array that we could make it not overwrite?
Maybe some sort of function that involves like some sort of inequality signs.
Not quite. Because we already
Could we
have
call
the
a function?
So what is the problem that we're saying to the computer right now? Right now, we're saying, go get the list UL and then make the inner HTML equal to this LI. Well, we don't really want it to equal that LI. We do want it to have that LI in it, but what else do we want to say inside that list UL? We want the existing list UL's inner HTML to stay in there, and what we're going to do is add in the LI with the value. In other words, whenever we set inner HTML, it's going to overwrite whatever is inside that list object. So what we want to do is we want to say, no, we still want this LI, we still want to add the value to it. All we're doing is tacking on an LI at the end of what's already in there. Well, what's already in there the first time we hit the add button? Nothing. So it's like, okay, no problem. Here's your LI. Now we add another LI, And that goes, oh, I'm going to take the existing li that is in there, add another list item, and add that on. So we can say first and hit add. We can say second and hit add. Now we go into the elements here and take a look at our UL, and we can actually see our two LIs here with our words added in between it.
Well, it definitely was a better answer what I was gonna come up with. I was gonna say, well, let's just create another variable and then just create another UL.
So we want to be careful, right? Because then we have to do that of, okay, what if they want a third list item? Now I need to go create another list item and add that to the list, right? And so by setting inner HTML, we're seeing here that it's overriding whatever's already in that, right? So we could come up here and we could say in our UL, we could add in a little text here that says add your first item to the list by using the text box above. Now, if we come in here, it does show that text, but if I type in ABC, we see that it is just adding onto it. So we probably don't want to do that. So don't follow me on that one. I'm just going to comment that out. But we can see that idea of it's just going to add on to the end of whatever's on that list. Okay, what's the other problem? If I add the word first in here and hit the add button, the word first still stays in here. And I'm like, you pesky little input. I want that to clear out, right? Whenever I enter that in there. Well, just like we can set inner HTML, it turns out that value is also a two-way thing. We can go into that input box and take whatever the value is in, or we can go back into that input box and set the value to something else. So down here, we can say input box dot value equals an empty string. Now, where's input box coming from? That's coming from up here. Oh, document get element by ID, inputted text. Okay, great. I can now reach into the value and clear that out. So I come over here, I type in ABC, I hit the add button, and now my input is cleared back out. And I think we can even do one more thing. We say input box dot focus. We can make it so when we type ABC and hit the add button, the cursor refocuses on my input box. Okay, that's pretty cool, but this is a little different. We didn't say focus equals something. We're not trying to set focus equal to something. What is focus? It's a method. We're saying this thing needs to go be run. So these are all properties of the document object model. Some properties are something that we can set. Some properties are things that we can retrieve. Some properties are two ways, like value. And then there are also some functions built in, like dot focus, to say, hey, browser, this is the thing that I want you to do. I don't know if there's a dot clear. No, there's not a dot clear. Okay, any questions about this code so far? All right. Got a little bit more to do. We are in here and I say ABC and I hit the enter button on my keyboard and nothing happens. And I'm like, okay, well, I really expected that to add it to the list. The proper way to fix this is by using a form element. However, we are practicing with events, right? And so Terry, you asked, well, can I make it so if they hit a key that something happens? Well, that's exactly what we want to do right here. If they hit the enter key, we want to do something. So in order to practice with that, we are going to say hey, we are going to create a new function. And that function is going to be a key pressed. And that is going to get the event of a key getting pressed. And then I am going to console log out key pressed. And again, there are multiple ways of achieving this. This isn't necessarily the best way, but it is showing events for the first time. And so we want to say, hey, when a key is pressed, go log out key pressed so we know about it. Well, I come over here and I type a key and I hit the enter button and nothing happens. Well, functions in JavaScript don't run unless somewhere else in our code we call them, we ask them to execute, or we ask our HTML to execute them based off of an event. That event that we want to use, just like the onClick here, needs to be added to an HTML element. So in our input, we're going to say on key down, fire our key press function, and give it the details of the event that is causing that to happen. So not only did we add our key pressed right here and our console log key pressed, we also added our on key down right here. Because this name and this name line up, now we are able to come over here, type a letter, and get key pressed. You do have to be focused inside that input in order for that to show up. Leave it there for a second. Does anyone not have a key press? Anyone need one more minute, or are we all good?
Need one more minute.
You got it.
So as we're entering, supposed to like keep adding to the list as we're going down in the bullets, right?
Yes. So if you do A, B, C and hit add, and then D, E, F and hit add, you should see both of them.
I fixed it.
Good work. All right. Anyone else need a minute? Anyone else have questions? Okay. Well, we've got a problem here. Every time we press a key, it's increasing the number of times that key pressing is coming out. We only want it to be to run though when the enter key is pressed. What JavaScript concept are we going to use or keyword to make that happen?
Is that a keyword?
Yep.
Wait,
Is it like a get element?
Not quite.
no, it's
How do we make something happen only if something is true?
If
wait, we use a Boolean?
Boolean?
Yeah,
We're going to use an
Boolean.
if statement. Yep. We're
If.
going to say if something. We want to say if the key is equal to enter. But if we try that in our JavaScript, we type a letter and it's like key is not defined. It doesn't know what key is. So I'm like, all right, where would I get the details of what key was getting pressed? We have this event lingering up here. That's what I want to get more details on. How do we get more details? How do we see under the hood of what's happening in our code? We can change this to event right here. Now in our console log, we're going to see our first event under the hood. We're still seeing this error here, but if I type any letter into that input, I now see this thing called keyboard event. And there is a ton of data in here. There is information about, is the Alt key pressed? Is this event going to bubble up? Basically, is this event going to cancel other events when it happens? But we come down here and we see, interestingly enough, there is something called key. What else do we notice about this? In this JavaScript, there's a curly brace here. And what do we notice about all of these details? The key of the object is over on the left side, and the value of the object is over on the right side. So if I type in B and C, I get 2 more keyboard events, and what's in that? The key of B and C. Well, now what happens if I click in there and hit the enter key? It says key equals enter. So I come back to my JavaScript and I say, hey, if the event.key equals enter with a capital E, don't make the mistake that I just did, enter as a capital E in it, then we want something to happen. What do we want to happen? We would like add item to happen. So we save that, we come back over here, we type in ABC, we hit the enter button, and look what shows up. Now we type DEF, hit the enter button, and we have built our first JavaScript app. Now is the time I expect questions. We will be revisiting this app. We'll make it so that you can check items off, so that you can remove items. We're going to revisit this in React as well, so you'll learn additional concepts through this. But we are going to spend the next couple minutes going through documenting this out so that we can understand it. Again, this is something that a lot of students say, you know what, I'm just going to do the numbers in my code, and then after class, I'm going to go through and try and do it on my own. Because my version with all of the descriptions in it will be up in GitHub. So if you get stuck on any of those numbers, you can always circle back and see what my description is. But just a learning concept for you, learning technique for you there. Anyone have questions? Anyone not have their code working before I do a top to bottom review of this?
Wait, Max, but why can't we add the else statement to the if statement and in the Java script?
What else would you like to happen?
That's a good question.
So that's why we don't have to add it, right? We could add as many else ifs and a final else that we wanted to. We could say something like, if event key, don't follow me on this, just for an example, console log, ooh, we care. And then we could say else, console log, it's just a boring letter pressed. Now, when we come over here and say ABC, we get it's just a boring letter pressed. But when we hit enter, we say, ooh, we care. Right? We could do else statements, it's totally fine. But in this case, I'm like, but I don't care if a key is pressed and when this input is focused, that's fine. All I care about if the event key is equal to enter. And we can even take out these console logs because we don't want to clutter our console when we're working on additional features that we add to this.
I got a
Okay, I
question.
lied. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So const key press equals event. How does it know to reference? Is it looking for like any events that are happening at all, or is key press?
It's because it's linked to the on key down of the input.
Oh, gotcha.
There are ways to add events in our JavaScript without modifying our HTML, but this is the easiest way to get started with it. You can also, in our JavaScript, again, don't follow me on this, say document.add event listener, typed, and then you can specify like on key down here, or maybe just key down. Yep, and then you can say
You just tie it to a variable.
console.log key pressed. And now over here, if you type an A, B, C, even though I'm not in that input, you'll see it's still logging out my key press. So it is entirely possible. And we will do projects where instead of our HTML reaching into our JavaScript reaches into our HTML. This is a very common thing to do. There's no preference one way or the other.
So Max, why do we add the parentheses on the input box focus instead of curly braces?
Repeat that question.
Why do we add the parentheses at the end of inbox dot focus instead of curly braces?
Yeah, so we're executing a function. We're saying, hey, please go run this function called focus that is built into the computer, except it doesn't take any parameters. You don't need any additional details how to execute focus. So here we're saying, hey, input box, set a very specific property called value equal to an empty string, right? That is updating a variable's value. That isn't executing a function. However, when we call .focus here, that's kind of like saying, hey, console.log. And if I just say console.log here, you notice my code doesn't break? Just nothing happens. Well, the difference between saying console.log and console.log with parentheses is now I would like you to go actually execute that console.log. I would like you to log something out. So now if we refresh, still nothing happens, but it's actually running my console log. Now my console log needs additional details. It's like, what do you want me to log out? I want you to log out true. Now, when we hit the add item button, you will see we get true in the console, right? So the difference between console.log, it's like, yeah, I know what that is. What about it? Compared to console.log with parentheses is saying, okay, now go run that console.log. And then the console.log with a variable inside of it or some data inside of it is saying, okay, now I'm taking those parameters and logging that out for you. So by calling these this here, we're saying basically go execute this function that's built in called focus. The same reason why we put parentheses up here. We're saying, hey, go run this function called key pressed. The difference is here, we do want some additional details. We want the details of that event. So that's why we put that into the parentheses there. Very good question. Parentheses after something are saying execute it. Sorry, what was that, Joe?
Is there a place we can look up like a repository for like all of the built-in functions that we can actually see what they're doing?
Yes, but it's going to be so overwhelming that it may not be worth it. And it also can oddly vary based off of what JavaScript engine you're using. All three web browsers have different JavaScript engines. And then, of course, Node itself is a different engine than the three that the browser uses. So V8, I want to say SpiderMonkey, and I'm blanking on what the third one is. But you can get a list if you just do a search for like built-in JavaScript functions. You'll see that there is a list of standard built-in objects. And then there are things in here. We haven't gotten into parsing yet. Errors we touched on a little bit. There is a list in here that you can go through, but it is such a long list that it may be overwhelming. Okay, it is 7 o'clock. Go on break. When we come back, we will comment out all of this code. Then we will review the terms list and go from there. Welcome back, everyone. All right. So we have successfully completed our first app, but at this point, you can pat yourself on the back for saying, all right, yeah, I followed along, but did you really understand it, right? So we're going to go through and go number first. Let's just understand what's happening in what order, and then 2, do the descriptions, right? At any point in this process, you are welcome to go, no, that still doesn't make sense to me. Please re-explain. Ooh, it looks like there are some new layout options in Zoom. This looks fancy. Ooh, let's try this one. Okay, so back to our code. First thing that happens is our HTML loads up. Our HTML loads up and it goes, all right, number 1, create text input for user to type into. Okay, then it number 2, create button that the user can click on to add the item to the list. Number 3, create empty UL as a placeholder that we can add the list items to in the future. In the future, apparently, in the future. Okay, now we get into number 4. This is new territory in here. Number 4, add, actually we'll say execute script.js. Okay, now we jump into our JavaScript and it goes number 5. I leave off on 5. Yes, 5. Console log out string connected. So our HTML is confirmed. So our JavaScript is confirmed linked to our HTML. Then we come down here and we say number 6, create a function called add item, but don't run it. Whenever we create a function, that function doesn't actually run. That function doesn't run. All we're doing is defining the function, right? We're saying, what happens when we ask add item to run? All of this stuff should happen, but it's not happening yet. It doesn't happen when the page first loads. We're just defining what functionality should be in there. Then we do the same thing for number 7. Define or create a function called key press, but don't run it yet. Now it comes down here, end of the file, whoop-de-doo, we're done. But we're not, because we've got other code that executes here. So we got to go through those steps. So what happens next? The user clicks inside the input. Number 8, user clicks inside input and adds some text. Because they are pressing down on a key, I don't know if it's going to let me do a comment there. So let me do a comment here. No, I can't do comments inside. which fires on key down event. Now that key pressed lines up with number 9, triggered by number 8. This function runs because a key down event fired from the text input. Now we come down here and say number 10. If the key from the event details is equal to enter, run the add item function. It isn't yet, so ignore. What do we mean by ignore? There's no else statement here, right? The key isn't entered. Okay, so they type in first item, and then they come up here and they click on number 11. User clicks on the add button. So we go to number 12, add button pressed from HTML on click event. So run this function. Number 13, go to the HTML document, find an element with an ID of inputted text, and store it in a variable called input box. Use 14. Use the variable from number 13 to access the property of value from the HTML input. And store it in value. 15. Go back to the HTML and access the element with an ID of list items from number 3. Right? So this is not the order necessarily that we wrote the code, but this is the order that all of this executes. So number 16, set the inner HTML from number 15 to whatever its current inner HTML is, plus a li plus the value from number 14 plus another closing li. Clear the input box from number 13 by setting its value to an empty string. 18, refocus the input box, excuse me, so the cursor displays in it so we can add more items. Then we could come back down here and say number 19, user actually presses the enter button while in the input box. Number 19, the key pressed event fires with the details setting the key to enter.
It should be 20 max.
Thank you. And then 21, execute the add item function by calling its name and adding parentheses after it. I've never been able to spell that word. Did I actually get it right? Oh, I did. Parentheses. Okay. Now we've actually documented everything out. So take a minute, scroll through this live share, take 2 minutes even, read through the comments, and if you don't understand the comment, tell me what number and I will try and re-explain it. Or if there's something that you've been stuck on this entire time, now's the time to ask it.
I got a question. So,
No questions. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
So I noticed that you use more of the single line comments rather than the multi-line comments. Like why do you do that? And have in my part two to that question is do like with like any of your job, like have you ever like seen anybody use a multi-line comment before? So in some way.
Absolutely, yeah. So the real answer is it's just convenience, right? So if I have all 3 of these lines highlighted and I hit Command slash and then Command slash again, VS Code is just putting in multiple single line comments. So that's the main reason why I'm using them, is because VS Code is putting in the double slashes for me. Could I come in here and do a slash star and then a star slash at the end? Absolutely. And I could take these out and it would be completely valid, right? So the multi-line comments are usually used when you know that you're writing like a paragraph of text, right? So if you know you are describing a function and it takes all of these parameters and there's expected behavior and you've got to be warned when not to use it and it may fire unexpectedly, and right, there's all of this detail that you want to put in there, by all means use a multi-line comment. And that's when I've seen them be used professionally. But in this case, because we're at the point where I know each one of these is only going to roughly be a sentence, I'm using the single line comment in that situation.
So would you so for us to review like our notes and like comment like what we did in our code, would you recommend us using single line or would you recommend us use multi-line?
Usually single line, unless you know, like I said, you have a lot, like you're gonna say like, oh, I have an entire paragraph to write here, then you would use the multi-line. But it isn't necessarily considered bad to have multiple single line comments in a row. It's really just at that point personal preference. There is something also called JSDoc. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but the idea of JSDoc, let me see if I can, is that when you define a function, you you put all of the details about it. So you do something like this. You say, hey, I made a new function called book, and it takes the title and the author. And so there's a standard called JSDoc where you say like what the function does. Then you say how you call the function. Constructors are really getting in the weeds, and then you define the parameters of the type of the function or the type of the argument that's getting passed in, the name of it, and then the description of it. Obviously, you can see here we're using a multi-line document because we're describing multiple things. So you definitely can use multi-line. You'll see me use more single line, but you'll also see me get to the end of a long sentence here and say, oh, this is getting a little too long for me. So I may wrap this down and then like indent it with a couple spaces so it lines up. That's totally fine. Or I could convert this to a single line comment or a multi-line comment, but it all just depends. Safi.
Right. You mentioned being able to essentially name event, or at least give it whatever name that we wanted, but why was it that we used event twice, or we named it twice, even though they're essentially—
Because there were 2 separate events. the first event was the button getting clicked on. And so that will have different properties than the event of the key getting pressed.
Right. So just in the naming, how come we didn't do event 1 and event 2? It didn't really matter, essentially.
Because the scope of the parameters are defined by the block of this code. So I wouldn't actually be able to access, if I did console.log event here, it's going to say undefined because it's like, what event are you talking about? So the event is actually scoped into the scope of this parameter. So I can only access event actually in here. And so that's why they didn't conflict. Now, when I do the event in here, I get all the details of the keyboard event. So parameters are always scoped in the context of the function that they are called in.
Okay, thank you.
And because of that, the two won't conflict. Event key, did you get the key from the web console? Yes. So the .key, what we did is we did a console.log event here. Then when we pressed that, we got this detail here. And when we expanded that, we were able to see that there was a property called .key. And then if we typed another letter there, we were able to see that key got set to C. And then when we hit enter, it said key equals enter. And so that's how I knew to use not only the enter value here, but to use the .key right here. And I knew to use dot notation because this is an object, we have key value pairs, and those curly braces are also giving it away. Other questions about this code? I promise you, I understand this code from top to bottom. This is not something that I'm doing just for fun. We do these projects to incrementally build that knowledge, right? To reinforce the concepts that we've already touched on. So you will not make it to graduation if all you do is follow along with my code for 24 weeks. Not to mention your capstone project. So there's no way to really do your capstone project unless you're extracting out the knowledge from this. That's something I can help with. It's not something I can do. You can lead the horse to water, can't make him drink. Why do we have this? ListUL inner HTML equals ListUL inner HTML plus li plus the value. So here, we're basically generating the, oh, no, wrong section. We're basically generating the HTML that we want to set in. So in our JavaScript, the value is coming from the input box, right? So we're extracting out whatever they type in, and then we're literally putting an li on either side of it because we want that item to show up as a bullet point, right? The problem is if we don't add in this ListUL inner HTML plus the new stuff on the end of it, it's going to just overwrite whatever is in that existing inner HTML and set it equal to the new list item with the value in between it. And so what we do instead is we say, take whatever is in that inner HTML already and add on to the end of it an li, which the JavaScript's like, I don't know what an li is, but you want me to put those exact letters in, so that's what I'm going to do. Okay, now you want me to add in the value. That's not in a quote. That's not in string. So I'm going to go get that value from up here, which is coming from the input box, which is coming from the element, which is coming from the HTML document. So we are literally generating out, basically saying, take whatever is in the inner HTML right now, generate out a li, and then also in that li, put the value in between it. Can we use a different way? Yes, there are about 19 different ways we could do that. We could, don't follow me, it's just an example. We could say something like ListUL dot inner HTML plus equals, basically append on to the end of it that list item value, and this should work exactly the same. Oh, or not. ABC. I thought that. Oh,
I think it's
it would
'cause
help
you're
if I
a
could
T.
spell.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. A, B, C, D, E, F. That's another way of doing it. We could say there is a function called create element, and this is something that Ryan will teach you down the road. So you can say create const new li equals document dot create element li, and then you can say new li dot inner html is equal to this, and then you can say list ul dot append child new li, and now that also works. So this is a more manual way of creating the HTML element. This is kind of a shortcut that we created. So JavaScript's ignoring this as a string until I shove it into inner HTML, and then all of a sudden the web browser is like, oh crap, that's an actual element. I need to treat it like that. So this is kind of the more formal way, so to speak, of creating an element in JavaScript. And it would have all of the properties of a document object model object, because we're creating it manually, and then set the inner HTML of that, and then append the child. So there are lots and lots of different ways. There are lots and lots of different ways of going about that. Might not have switched the recording. Yeah, I don't know how the recordings are going to show up with this new background option, but I think it should have everything in it. I'm not too worried about it.
Oh, that's just to say that as you're typing, because it's your background, it's not as clear what you're typing.
Oh, that's good to know. Thank you. I'm gonna switch that over. Back to the old way. I'll check in the recording and see how that ends up. But yeah, it's possible my big head blocks what I'm typing, so might be better to do it the old school way. So yes, there are, and I'm sure there are lots of other ways of doing this as well. But just off the top of my head, I'll put in here alternative number 1 and alternative number 2. And what's kind of interesting is if we do all of these, we'll get the same item added twice. So that's a good way to prove that they do work. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions about this?
My question is, think of it in a more SQL way. Like, I know in our capstone we're gonna be later on implementing SQL. So is this
Yep.
like a somewhat in the same direction when we get to learning more about SQL? Is like, I would say like translating the input from HTML to then script to then SQL.
Yeah.
If you
So
get what I mean.
it will be basically the question that you are I don't want to say trying to ask, but if I put words in your mouth, the question you're trying to ask, or a good question to ask, let me put it that way, is if I add my tasks in here and refresh the page, how do I make it so they don't disappear? Well, when we get into React, we're going to get into what we call local storage, which is the ability to save some information into the web browser. Well, that's really helpful, but what happens when I want to load this on my phone based off of tasks that I add on my computer? Well, now you get into the need for a database. The problem is databases can't directly talk to our front end code. And so we will layer on React, but then we will also layer on the notion of an application programming interface, which is how do we get our back end to talk to our front end? And we'll be building what we call a REST API, representative state transfer. We will be building that in Node. and then our node will connect into our database. So we'll basically have multiple front ends, right? Our front end running on a lot of different people's computers that will all funnel into one API. And that API will be able to relay information back and forth between the database. So it's this whole three-way middleman kind of thing of the front end, the back end, and the database. But by week 22-ish, you'll have everything that you need to get all of that data flowing back and forth. So yes, we will revisit this app because it is a good one to show how do we get data flowing all over. Okay, so another question. Still confused on the inner HTML part. Why did we put it in twice? So if we take this out, let's see what happens. We add ABC. Oh, I'm not showing my screen. Sorry. Okay, so I took this list inner HTML out. Now, when I add a task, it works fine. And I'm like, great, I'm good to go, right? Well, now when I add in another item, my first task disappears. And I'm like, well, why is it disappearing? Because I'm saying take this inner HTML, overwrite whatever is in it, and just set it equal to this new list item. And I'm like, well, I don't want that to happen, but I still want to add in this list item. So what we basically say is set the list inner HTML equal to whatever the inner HTML currently is, plus this new stuff that I want to add on to the end of it.
Makes sense.
We basically make it append without using the word append. Other questions? Okay, not done with your engagement yet. We are going to switch over to, I don't know why I stopped sharing my screen, the terms list. So I'm going to head to Canvas. I'm going to head to modules, down to the term list. I will drop the link in the chat as well. We're going to jump down to week 5, because that's where we are at. Please take a moment, read through this list. And if there are items not on this list, or that there are terms that you don't agree with the definition, or there is a term that we have not used and you would like me to describe it, now is your time to engage on the terms list.
Is multi-line on the list?
It is not. We will add it.
Method on there?
It is not, but I'm going
weeds.
to put it under function, which better be on the list.
It's down at the bottom.
Let me just make sure. Not technically the same, but I've never, yeah, we're gonna say, they're not exactly the same thing. Method is used more in object-oriented programming. A function is used more in scripting programming. But because JavaScript has blurred the lines between those two paradigms, I think it's safe to say that the definition of those two get intermuddled.
Terminal reference in here, but I don't think I see a thing for it specifically.
No, we do not. If you are a note taker, if you've been taking notes all class or all week, now is an excellent opportunity to go through your notes and help out a fellow student by finding some keywords that you may have written down that you would like added to the terms list, or things that you were like, Max never defined this, but he doesn't shut up about using it.
Camel casing on there?
Camel casing. No.
How about technical debt?
Sorry, I'm just triggered by technical debt. That's a really sorry, I had to suppress some emotions there. Technical debt, yeah. A conscious decision. Well, I guess it doesn't have to be conscious, does it? I guess you can write shitty code and not realize you're writing shitty code. A
mountain of work to
consequence
overcome from previous sins.
by you or other team members.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just you fixing other people's stuff.
A consequence of writing, I'm going to say crappy code here. There are multiple ways you can write crappy code. You can write crappy code as an entry developer who doesn't know any better. You can write crappy code because you're under the gun. You've got a client who's saying, I need this right away. You can write crappy code because you thought the problem was simpler than it actually turned out to be. A consequence of writing crappy code. Would
inefficient be better?
It doesn't necessarily have to be inefficient. It could be very poorly written, but to the computer, it could be as equally as efficient, right? So sometimes it is actually higher quality code to write less efficient code. What do I mean?
So it's more understandable?
Yeah, it's more understandable for other developers, and it may take the computer more time to execute it, but it's in such a negligible way that it doesn't really matter. So efficient is like a very important word in computer science, and we don't even bother touching on it because it is so fast. You may hear someone say big O notation, and big O notation is basically saying how efficiently can the computer execute this code. And as you make it more complex, how does it impact the big O notation of the efficiency? I think that is complete and utter bullshit. I've never written big O notation. I've never factored that in. For me, all of my efficiency has been how long has that code taken to run? Is that too long? If it is too long, let me find a way to write it more efficiently. I've never once had to write big O notation in a decade-long career. I hope in my 20 plus years of continued development, I never have to touch on it again. That is a bias against computer science versus developer. That is a bias against engineer versus developer. So you won't hear me talking about big O notation, but it is, I guess, a term that you should be familiar with and know that it is related to the efficiency, basically the scientific notation that we can write out how efficient this code is, especially as the data expands or gets more complicated. Let me finish this and then I'll add index and recursion. Recursive, yeah, that's the word. Recursion to the list. A consequence of writing crappy code, you incur debt, i.e. harder to fix the longer the code is in there. Until you fix it, i.e. pay off the debt, or remove it. Index. I don't think I'm in the right week. Hold on. Yeah, I'm in week 7. Give me a second. Let me get this in the right spot. Index. The numbering system starting with the number 0, at least in JavaScript, that allows us to access specific items in an array. Recursive or recursion, both are related to each other. Apparently, I can't spell either one of them. A way of writing a loop in our code that may run an indeterminate number of times based off the inputted data by calling its own function from within itself. Recursion is not a week 5 topic. We may touch on recursion a little further on just because we are a day or two ahead. So I may try and come up with a recursion example. Recursion, I will add this to the definition. Recursion is something the computer does very efficiently, but is challenging for our human minds to understand. So recursion is just one of those really tough concepts. We get for loops. We go, all right, loop over this array. For every item in this array, give me access to it in this variable. And then this block of code, these curly braces are going to run every single time for each item in the array. Great, we got that. Then we get more complicated with a while loop, basically an if statement of does this loop keep running, or a for loop where we set up the index as 0, loop through it a certain number of times, great, no problem. But when we get into recursion, we basically say, keep on doing this by passing more data in that's slightly different until you reach this end case. And then when you finally reach that end case, you no longer need to keep on calling yourself to do something. Really, really weird concept to understand. The computer's like, oh, you want me to do exactly what I already do? I'm going to go do that thing again. Really weird to wrap your head around that. So if recursion is something that you're like, I'm struggling to get for loops right now, put recursion to the back of your mind. But it is unfortunately a very popular topic to ask about in technical interviews. Employers love testing on recursion, even though it is not as widely used as for loops. It is definitely a tough concept to learn, and therefore a topic that employers love to test on. Input validation. Usually using regex, which we're going to define first, regex or regular expression. A pattern written as a string that allows us to match against other text. So basically, it is a specific way of writing a pattern that allows us to see if that pattern occurs against text that we tested against. So input validation doesn't have to be done using regex, right? We can say if the string.length is less than 8, this input is no longer valid. But when we get into more complicated patterns, regex is really powerful because we can say, does it include a symbol? Does it include this number of characters? Is a character repeated more than a certain number of times? All of that can be in a regex. So to make sure the user inputted value meets requirements. So I'm just going to leave requirements vague. That could be length, that could be not empty, that could be number of symbols in it, that could be that you're not allowed to use numbers, all kinds of stuff there. How often should we comment our code in bigger projects? Why don't we comment as we go? Great question. If we comment as we go, I think a lot of times we get in this notion of it's like you're switching between English and JavaScript a little bit too much, right? We're already switching between HTML and JavaScript. For me, I find it a lot more helpful to get a chunk of it done and then go back and comment it. When we get into bigger projects, we will most certainly be commenting at the end of the day and not all the way at the end of the project, because we'll reach a point where we've got like 60 or 70 comments in there, and that would be insane to try and do all at once. So I think it's good to comment either when you get a section of the app done, right? We could have taken a break and said, all right, the add item is working. Let's go comment all of add item. But oftentimes the order that we write our code is not the order that the computer will execute our code. And so you can write comments either way. But for numbering, it tends to be more helpful to do it towards the end of either that work day or that project, because we may be adding in additional features that would change the order of all the other numbers. However, if you're just doing general context, if you're like, hey, I wouldn't have remembered what this line is doing. If I wrote this in the morning, I wouldn't remember what that was doing at the end of the day. That's the exact time that you would want to use inline comments the second that you got it functional, and add some context to that. So the way that I think about it is, if I pass this code off to another developer, would they be able to understand this line, or would they have to go Google it? And if they have to go Google it, if they need to go dive into what that function is doing or why it's written that way, I try and add a comment into it. You'll often see in the code that I write, I don't just write a comment. I actually start the comment out with MZM, my initials, and then I will date it and say 5/16/24, and then I will add my additional context into it right there. That's more important for when I'm like documenting technical debt, or when I'm going to do something that I'm going to forget about and then come back into that code to see if I actually did it. That can be really helpful, because other team members can stumble across this and be like, oh, turns out Max worked on this last and he knew there was more work to be done there, but he didn't have a chance to finish it. So it's often common to see initialed code in your comment and a date on it, but just something to throw out there. So yeah, totally fine to comment as you go. The main reason we don't comment as we go, especially, is we're numbering. Numbering is something we normally only do when we're learning. It's not necessarily something that we would do in like a production grade product, because at a certain point you reach a level where the user could do any number of things in any different order. And of course, we can't match that in our code, right? We can't do forks and go, all right, well, what if they hit the compose button first, or what if they open the email first? Well, at a certain point, we don't determine that, and we don't care. Both of them work. So the numbering is more of just an understanding of, hey, I'm in my HTML, and all of a sudden I went from 3 to 8. where did number 4 go? Oh, right, number 4 is over in our JavaScript. I don't think that number actually lines up. But that is why we number them here. So hopefully that answers the question and isn't too much of a rampage there. Desiree, did I answer your question or any follow-up questions on that? Cool. Back to the list. Node-v is a command we run in the terminal to check the current version of Node, the current installed version of Node, I should say. We'll see more about command line arguments and flags as we go, but -v is a good one to add to the list. Function number, function sort of, yes, that's a good recursive example. The only thing that you're missing there is the if statement that will break that function call. But yes, that is a basic idea of recursion. Global versus local scope. If a variable is defined at the root level of our code, i.e. not inside any curly braces, it will be accessible in any scope. However, if we define a new scope by creating a function or loop, trying to think if there's any other way that I can create an additional scope. That's fine for now. And define a variable inside of it, we won't be able to access that variable in the global scope. Okay, what do we mean by that? Because I haven't touched on scope yet, and I think that you guys have a good understanding. So if I say const num1 equals 5, and I console log num1, don't follow me on this, just an example. When I refresh, I see 5 come out. Of course we do, right? This variable is what we call global scope. It's not inside any curly braces. We created it literally at the global level, at the root level. There's no indentation there. But if I say const myfunc equals some new function and say num2 equals 5, oh, that's a bad example. Num2 equals 3, 2, whatever. And I console log out num2, of course, I'm able to see that when I run it. So when I call myfunc, I see 2 come out. However, because num2 was created inside of this function, it now has what is called a different scope. So if I try and access my num2 outside of this function, even after I call it, I'm going to see that num2 is not defined. What do you mean num2 is not defined? It's defined right here. Because it was created inside curly braces, I can't access that outside of the curly braces. So we call this global scope, meaning it was declared outside of any curly braces, compared to local scope, which is saying what do we have access to inside this function. Well, what happens if you put a function in a function? Well, you can actually do that, and you will have access to anything inside the parent, but not outside of that. Does that make sense? Scope, I think, is often overblown. I think that they really nailed down that in Free Code Camp. They're like, you got to understand scope, and there are 20 different assignments for it. I don't think scope is really that important. The important thing to remember is if you declare a new variable inside a function, you won't be able to access it outside the function. And the fact that if you make it outside of any functions or for loops or any blocks, it will be considered global. Otherwise, it will be considered local. Mainly think of input validation in the cybersecurity sense in order to protect against XSS, cross-site scripting, and injection. I would push back on that and say input validation is more often used in something like a password field to make sure that the password is a certain length, which of course is still technically cybersecurity. But yes, there is something called sanitizing inputs to make sure that the user doesn't type something in that our SQL database or backend doesn't accidentally execute. So we will talk about SQL injection down the road, and we will be using a library called SQLize that prevents SQL injection built in. That was kind of like a 15-minute side tangent that we do when we get into SQL. But input validation is a very broad thing that could be used something as simple as your password isn't long enough, or something as complex as a user injected some malicious code that we don't want to actually execute. So both are totally fair ways to think about input validation. For loop term definition includes for of for arrays, but not for in of objects. Okie doke. Let me see. I will add a note here. There are also other kinds of for loops, like a for in, that allows us to loop over the keys of objects. For loops, while loops, recursive loops, do while loops are the only loops that I can think of off the top of my head, but there may be others. And then for loops obviously do break out into for of loops, traditional for loops, for in loops over objects. And there may be other ones that I don't know about. I think I got all of them. Proof that I do check MDN and get all of my answers from there.
Yeah, that's cool and all, but do we have script in there?
Who needs script?
We do.
I was surprised script didn't make the list.
Yeah, I mentioned the document object model briefly. It is covered in week 7, but the bridge between JavaScript and HTML, technically it's how the HTML gets translated to the JavaScript and back, right? So the DOM is this like really complex, mysterious thing, and I know how to operate about 2% of it, right? But if we think about it, you will never reach a point where you'll know every single function and every single property built into the DOM. That's just an unrealistic expectation. But document object model is basically the bridge between, I've got all of my HTML, but I can't interact with my HTML directly in my JavaScript. So what the DOM does is translate all of the HTML into all of these different objects and properties that I can interact with in my JavaScript. And then when I set something in my JavaScript that is related to that document object model, it will automatically translate it back into the HTML for me. So things like document.getElementById, that document is the document or is using the document object model. When I say get element by ID, it is getting that HTML and converting that HTML into an object that I can work with in my JavaScript. And then when I update that object in my JavaScript, it is reversing that document object model, finding it in my HTML and updating that for me. We will also see that concept used with an ORM, an object relational mapper, which is doing the same thing, except instead of JavaScript to HTML, it's going to take our JavaScript and convert it to SQL, or take our SQL and convert it to JavaScript objects. So that's coming down the line, but just wanted to plant that seed. Final call for questions tonight. All right, we're going to use the last 9 minutes to get started for next week. No, I'm just kidding. It's Thursday. You guys are done. Next week, you have Nathan. I will still be around, so if you need to schedule one-on-ones, if you're working on some free code camp assignments, if you would just like to talk, if you would just like to cry about how hard JavaScript is, one-on-ones are available to you. Feel free to schedule them. The link is in Canvas. Under Calendly, I think I changed the name to one-on-one so you can find it. Reminder that your homework this week is the 10-question homework assignment. Your homework for the following week is capstone wireframes. When I come back, I will be cracking the whip. You will all be sharing your wireframes as a class, talking through your project ideas, showing what you've got wireframe-wise. If you would like me to review your wireframes, make sure you get them submitted a couple days before the assignment is due, so that I will be able to get you some feedback on them before you have to present them for class. One-on-ones do book quickly after class, so don't be surprised if one disappears as you're booking it, especially towards the end of the program. It gets real competitive real fast. Nathan will be back in. Remind Nathan at 7 p.m. You guys like to take a 25-minute break. While I am usually pretty diligent about getting it within 5 minutes, he may forget that. So don't be afraid to say, hey, 7 p.m., can we please take a break soon? We are off for Memorial Day. So you guys are in next week in Zoom, as always, for Nathan, for DevOps. We are out Monday, I believe it is the 27th. The day you come back, capstone wireframes, check-ins, and we will go from there. That is all that I have for you. If you have any questions, you can ask them now. Otherwise, go enjoy the next 7 minutes and the next week that you don't have to see my face. Cornelius, what questions do you have? Oh, the code for attendance tonight was DOM? I think it was DOM, document object model. Thank you.
Yes. My question is, like, I know I already submitted mine, but you so if you already did it, do you want it like you already saw it, but do you want me like to update it and like, you know, get prepared for the class?
Yeah, so whenever you have additional things you would like feedback on, feel free to resubmit it, because I get an alert every time that it's resubmitted, and I can go back and review it. If you're doing multiple submissions, just include a note in there of like, this is what changed, or like these screens are what you should review, unless all of them have changed, and then just resubmit it.
Gotcha. Oh, and that's another thing too. I forgot. This was my first question though. When are mentors being assigned?
Hopefully tomorrow. I keep kicking that can down the road, but we're reaching the point where like you guys can really use a mentor, and you know, just talk about where you're at in the program. So I will try to get those done tomorrow, if not by Monday. Definitely by Monday.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, for the capstone thing. So say we're using Figma, do we like provide like a link, or do we like how does that work? Do we need to screenshot it, or
You can, a couple ways you can do it. If you're doing it in Figma, well, this is good for everyone here. If you're doing it on paper or a whiteboard, that's totally fine. You are not required to do it in Figma. So if you do it that way, just take pictures of it and make sure the pictures are clear enough that I can like understand it. But pictures are totally fine. They don't need to be scans. They don't need to be anything fancy. They don't need to be digitized. With that said, for Figma, you have a couple of different options. You can share the link with me as long as you make sure that I have access to that link. So you may need to say like anyone or public can view, or if you type in my email address, or it may say you're already on my team so I can access it. So a Figma link is fine as long as I can get into it. The other options you have, you can export it as a PNG or a PDF, and then just upload that. I can review it that way. Or if you only have a couple of screens and screenshotting is easier, that is also fine. Sorry, I'm still here. The Sudafed is kicking in, and watching someone blow their nose is always gross.
So what'd you say about the share link? So I could just share it. Do I need to share it on Slack, or do I need to share it on
You should be able to share the link in the Canvas assignment. So if you just paste the link in there, just make sure that it's set like if you open an incognito window and paste the link in, make sure that it still comes up. And if it does, then I have access to it and the link is fine.
Okay.
So like for the link,
Yeah.
if we like update our markups,
Designs. Yeah.
does it like update it on the link? Okay.
It does. Yes.
Okay.
So if you're in the car project, and I'm gonna just share this because good for everyone to see. When you go to share, if it says my name right here and everyone else's, then I already have access to it, and you can just share copy link and paste that into Canvas and submit it. If I am not listed here, you can change this to anyone with the link can view, and then you can, and once it's set to that, then you can copy and paste that link in. Other questions for tonight? Have an awesome evening, and I will see you all next Tuesday, believe it or not.